Hey everyone, I'm making this screencast to talk about the ending of The Handmaid's Tale, and it's kind of late, and I just made breakfast for my iStep testers, so I hope I'm coherent enough to do this well for you. My students commonly don't actually read the historical notes because they think that it's just some notes that are stuck at the end, but actually the historical notes are a really important part of Margaret Atwood's development of the theme of this work, and I want to talk about why it's important. So at the end of the book, you have this person presenting at an academic conference, and we're pushed forward all of a sudden to 200 years in the future. And we learn a couple things about this futuristic society. One, we learn that the Republic of Gilead doesn't exist anymore. And we also learned that the Republic of Gilead was just one country amongst lots of other countries in the world. And we kind of know this because the tourists come and they see Offred and she feels uncomfortable. But I don't think we fully grasp that this is just one country in the world where things are happening. It's, the center of the world for Offred. But other things are going on and life is going on just normal in other places. And I think one of you guys asked why don't the other countries do something about it? Well, do we do anything about the fact that women can't drive cars in Saudi Arabia? Do we do anything about the fact that 10-year-old girls are being raped and married off in other countries, that there's not laws protecting them from these things? No, we don't. We don't invade countries for that reason. And so countries aren't invading the Republic of Gilead either. They're just supposed to kind of take care of themselves. And I'm sure the other countries are thinking, well, things are pretty bad there, but nobody's doing anything about it. And as we see in the ending, we see that there are other civilizations going on. And 200 years later, the Republic of Gilead has not survived. And historians are studying it. And the way this is kind of set up is it's set up like an academic conference. And I've presented at conferences like this. I've gone to conferences like this. And Margaret Atwood really gets the tone right. The language shifts a lot. Offred writes in this really poetic language that's beautiful, but also mysterious. And it's also, her language is kind of lonely. And all of a sudden we're shifted into this really academic intellectual prose that's difficult to follow. And is full of bad academic jokes. I mean, the crowd kind of likes it, right? But and that's what these conferences are like. It's people that are very self-important, that are talking about like this one little thing that they're super interested in, and they're making bad jokes to keep it going. We also learned that it seems like it's a pretty diverse audience. If you listen to the names of the people, they sound like they come from diverse backgrounds. And so the Republic of Gilead has not survived, and it's kind of white supremacist type attitudes. And it seems as if there's women in the audience that are doing work too, and that are colleagues to this band that's presenting. So, the Republic of Gilead just doesn't exist like that. Okay. However, this ending really has to do with history and how we view history and what the purpose is of history and what the role historians have in understanding our history and teaching us about history. And I think Atwood is essentially kind of saying in this chapter that it's really important how we view and understand history and what voices we're listening to and who we're giving power to, and that we're learning from the mistakes of our history. Margaret Atwood studied a lot of Puritan literature from the early days of America, and she saw a lot of commonalities in what was going on in the rise of religious extremism in the Middle East, and also the rise of religious extremism in the United States. And she didn't want history to repeat itself. There's this part at the ending where they're talked to, there's just this quote, and I think this is an important quote. "We may call Eurydice forth from the world of the dead, but we cannot make her answer. And when we turn to look at her, we glimpse her only for a moment before she slips from our grasp and flees. As all historians know, the past is our great darkness and filled with echoes. Voices may reach us from it, but what they say to us is imbued with the obscurity of the matrix out of which they come, and try as we may, we cannot always decipher them precisely in the clearer light of our own day. There's a little bit, this is a really beautiful quote, and it alludes to Eurydice, who is dead and who's in Greek mythology, and whose husband tries to bring her back from the dead with his music. And we're just trying to call the past back to us. But the speaker here is really arrogant, that he's kind of in this clearer light of our own day, and kind of pretends that we can live as enlightened people in this modern world. And I think Atwood is being a little judgmental, like her, even though the speaker is the one speaking, Atwood is using that to kind of call into question, is your clear light of your own day, does that even exist? Can you really adequately understand your own time period and judge your own time period in that moment? But at the same time, who are those voices you're listening to? And this speaker, the scholar, is really interested in Offred and this really great find of these tapes and stuff. This is a great academic find for a historian. And yet he complains that she's not reliable, that he doesn't give her the details that he really wanted to know. And he just questions her. And again, Offred, even in her death, in the records that she's left, she's questioned, like she's not good enough. She hasn't produced something. If only we could have heard from more of the commanders who are really in the know about the powerful political dealings that were going on. And why do we have to hear about what's going on in the kitchen and what's going on at the births of these children? The historian's really kind of disappointed that this is the voice that he's left with from history. And I think Atwood is saying, no, all voices are important to history. And if we're only listening to the powerful voices, then we're really missing something in our history. There's also a point in the book where someone says, better never means better for everyone. It always means worse for some. And I think this kind of goes back to how Atwood's viewing history and understanding history. You know, it's tempting to think of history as a progress towards something that's modern and something that's progressive and something that's good. Like, we know better. We have better things now. But there's this idea that you know, the better for someone, it comes at the expense of putting someone else down. And that's part of our history too. And you know, again, in the clear light of our own day, well, maybe we have reached this really great point of progress, but maybe we haven't, and that point of our pride, and that could be our downfall. And again, just to go back, I think this kind of comes back to the main point that Atwood is making here. If I may be permitted an editorial aside, the professor begins, allow me to say that in my opinion, we must be cautious about passing moral judgment upon the Gileadians. Surely we have learned by now that such judgments are of necessity of culture specific. Also, Gileadian society was under a good deal of pressure, demographic and otherwise, and was subject to factors from which we ourselves are happy more free. Our job is not to censure, but to understand. And I think, again, Atwood is being so judgmental of this attitude that so often historians take, that we need to be sensitive when viewing the culture, other people's cultures and other people's histories, that we need to say, well, you know, they were still good people. And we see this so much. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about, you know, Confederate Army generals and how we recognize and honor them. And there's been so much positive talk about them. And yet they fought to keep slavery in our country. You know, and we sugarcoat it to say, like, oh, well, they wanted, you know, they were more concerned with keeping the Union together, or they really took pride in their Southern heritage. But they also fought to keep slavery around. You know, so we do this too. We say, well, we can't understand the whole context. We have to be sympathetic. Thomas Jefferson was a great president despite owning slaves. We like to say these things. And I think Atwood is using kind of this person, this figure, to show just how troubling that kind of attitude is, that maybe we need to look back at our past and say, well, this was wrong, regardless of the context, regardless of the complexities of those. And we can understand the complexities of those situations. That there are things that are wrong and we can call them wrong. And I think Atwood is trying to say that through this historian, that, yeah, he's saying not to judge, but look at the whole culture of Gilead. Like, we should judge that. That's a really scary culture. We shouldn't just say, well, that was an interesting period of time in history. Let's study it more. That we need to learn from our history, because there's a danger that we can go back and repeat that history. And the book ends with this really great quote. Are there any questions? And I guess it does raise a lot of questions. It raises questions for how we interpret the future, how we deal with the present, and then just all the questions that we have that are unanswered about Gilead. So, okay, well, I hope that's helpful to you guys, and I look forward to your discussion on this topic. Thanks.